Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank the association for this opportunity. And equally as much, what makes it possible is our association with McCloskey Mills, who have been responsible stewards in the industry. A great team we have there, and very lucky to be associated with that business. So my brief today was to talk about global peanut markets and what we expect in the markets. What has happened in the equity markets in the last 1 month, it's a sobering sort of thought and it's a tough topic, but I'll try and do justice to that. I'll be delving more in other competing origins, other markets rather than US, because I'm sure the team here knows a lot more what's happening in the US than I can ever lay a claim to. So with that note, my first slide is about global peanut production. So if you were to see in year 15 and 16, which is the USDA marketing year, and this is the USDA data, we'll have plenty full supply as far as peanuts are concerned. Not too much increase from 39.4 million metric tons last year to 40 million metric tons, about 1.5–2% increase. But what is important to note here, the three runners origins, three competing origins for runners, which is US, Argentina, and Brazil. There's a very significant supply increase across these three origins, and primarily driven by United States. Argentina had a record crop last year. They had very good yields, record acreage, and this year again they are heading for very good yields. So they will once again have a big crop. And Brazil has been steady, 810,000 hectares, and I think they are planting the same hectarage this year and expecting a very good yield. So that is broadly the total supply situation that we're looking at this year. World exports. This is really the essence, like Carl said, what is the total market for peanuts and what is the excess that peanut industry can have in terms of liquidity options. So we saw the world trade in peanuts jump up to 3.2 million tons in the year 14-15, and primarily because China had a short crop, and China certainly emerged as a large importer of peanuts. And most of that trade flow happened between India and China, but to some degree from US to China as well. In 15-16, that trade has moderated a bit, especially the India-China leg, because India had a short crop. Visible in the numbers in the previous slide, India 4 million metric tons down, almost 10% from previous year. So the trade this year again is reverting to what is the base level of 2.8 million metric tons. So we expect the trade to dip to 2.8 million metric tons, and going forward next 1 year probably stay at that level. And the reason for that is, if you see all the markets, important peanut markets, Europe is the largest market outside of United States. The data, the consumption data is probably showing a growth of less than 1% a year. And there's a lot of noise in the data, and that is despite the steep reduction that we've seen in the prices. Globally, if you were to see peanuts, the entire health message from which other edible nuts have benefited, almonds, cashews, the consumption has increased so much, that sort of trend has passed us by as far as the peanut industry is concerned. The other big secular theme about rising middle income price or purchasing ability in the emerging markets will also lead to increase in commodity consumption. The data is weak as far as that is concerned, that it's benefiting peanuts. And primarily there, the reason could be, aside from consumers' preference, also could be the barriers that we have in imports. So in India, it's virtually impossible to import any raw or in-shell peanuts. And in China, we have very high tariff barriers for imports. So as a consequence of that, unless that changes, we expect the trade to stay at 2.8 million metric tons sort of levels. Even US, if you were to see as a market, the growth rates have been between 1.5% to 2.5% over the last 5 years, despite prices being very attractive. Another important variable that we track, which is the ending stocks, because at the end of the day, prices are a function of what the stock expectation is going forward. If you were to see, there's a dramatic increase, and I'm just talking about the main origins here, not so much the world data. There's a dramatic increase in ending stock from 1.7 million tons to almost 2 million metric tons, and once again primarily driven by US, where we've seen a significant increase in the plantings. The prices are very highly correlated to the ending stock expectation that the industry has going forward. 1 year forward, what will be the ending stocks? And that's the reason why you see the drop in prices, because there's been plentiful supply not only this year but by and large over the last 2-3 years. These are the prices of peanuts for various origins, and the red line there is Chinese peanut prices. You see a divergence, the Chinese prices diverging from rest of the origins, because China had a sharp drop in 14. And that essentially led to a surge in exports that we discussed in the previous slide. And our fear is that going forward, that opportunity may not be available. So the large volumes that we saw getting traded into China may not be available to the market as of now going forward. Moving on to the main competing origin, Argentina. Despite being in a very challenging environment, Argentina had record shipments in 2015 or 2015 crop. They hit almost 550,000 tons of edible shipments. And if you were to see the makeup of that, a very significant portion, almost 50% of that is blanched peanuts. And red skin proportion is about 50%. The rest is ingredients. They export some peanut butter into Middle East and other markets. So after having a record year last year, and the fact that they had very tough conditions because of the low prices, one was expecting that there will be a dramatic drop in the acreage they're going to plant for 2016. But Argentine industry hasn't really backed down, and they've once again gone ahead and planted almost 320,000 hectares, which is a very high area, relatively speaking, given the market conditions for that origin. And the crop 16 is progressing reasonably well. They may not have the same needs they had last year, but I think it will still be top 25 percentile sort of yields that they've had historically speaking. And Argentina, in our estimate, will end up exporting close to 500,000 tons of peanuts even in the next 1 year. Why they have planted the acreage they have planted, despite last 2 years being challenging for that industry? So one biggest reason is that they have overcapacity as far as shelling is concerned. So their record crop has been 1.2 million metric tons, but the installed shelling capacity in that country is 1.6 million metric tons. So I think their average volumes that they plant is about 1 million metric tons. They have almost 50 to 60% overcapacity in shelling. It was built in the heady years of 2010, 11, 12. That's when people invested in it. And the moment that shelling capacity expansion happened, the margins came under pressure, and the subsequent 2 years have been bad years for the industry. So there's been quite a lot of wasteful investment, I would say, that has occurred in Argentina. And as a consequence of that, irrespective of the parities, they have to continue to invest in planting, and they have to continue to invest in export. That was the situation until last year. But in the last 3 months, there's been a lot of change as far as Argentine industry is concerned. Their currency has depreciated almost 45% in the last 3 months. Doesn't mean to say that Argentine peanuts will be suddenly 45% cheaper because their currency has depreciated. Most of the costs in the industry are dollar-denominated costs. But another big advantage that they have now is that they used to have an export tax on peanuts, which is very rare. Usually countries encourage export of commodities. There they had a tax. That tax has been removed. So that tax leads to about $75 of cost advantage relative to what it was in the past. And the currency depreciation leads to about $50 of lowering of costs. So their costs today are probably lower by $125 to $150 as compared to what it was until last year. And that's the reason why the excess capacity in the industry the fact that their cost structure is looking better now, that's a reason why they'll continue to plant about 1 million metric tons and continue to export. Another thing to note is that as far as the customers in Europe are concerned, they like the flavor of Argentine peanuts and relatively more consistent as far as aflatoxin is concerned. And no large customer wants to be reliant on one single origin. Okay, it's a natural crop, and there could be weather events which could affect supply, which could affect the quality. They like to have at least 2, if not 3 origins in their portfolio. So there's a lot of pull also from the customer side, which is there as far as Argentina is concerned. So our view on Argentina being that they continue to export close to 500,000 metric tons of kernels. Brazil, it's an origin that everybody talks about, and there have been a lot of positive developments in Brazil, but it is not really performing nowhere close to the potential it has. And peanuts are planted in rotation to sugarcane, and every once in 5 years or 6 years you're supposed to do that rotation. And if that rotation were to be strictly followed, they should be planting 3 or 4 times the peanuts that they plant. But they've been at 110,000 sort of hectares for the last 2 years. There's been some growth in their acreage, not very significant. But what has happened in Brazil is that there's a lot of investment which is happening in innovation, seed research, even shelling. They have adequate shelling capacity. Their problem once again is the markets. They don't have access to the markets like Argentina has. And also the markets are not really growing. But to their advantage, their currency also has depreciated significantly over the last 3 years, as the graph shows. And they also have certain productivity advantages over Argentina. So they have, in the peanut growing regions, on an average 30% more rainfall as compared to Argentina. And Argentina, which has a cold finish to the season and which really puts a limit on how much of yield they can get out of their farms. Brazil has far more heat units and a longer and more healthy growing season. So their yields are almost 10 to 15% higher than Argentina. Brazil, in our estimate, will continue to export 100,000 tons of peanuts. And they actually seem to have a cost leadership position as far as red skin peanuts are concerned. So as a consequence of that, you see them competing in some of the easier markets where vendor approval process is not all that tedious. You see Brazil taking more and more market share, not just from US, but even in Argentina. And I think in the next 1 year, we believe that they'll be able to hold on to their market share. 100,000 tons from Brazil seems like more or less a done deal. Another important origin, India, you could call it an origin or a market, depends on how you choose to look at it. The expectation last year was that India will increase its acreage by 15 to 20%. That didn't materialize because they didn't have favorable weather conditions for plantings. And there was a strong economic motivation to plant peanuts because other commodity competing crops, their prices were low. But because of the weather limitations, they could not get it planted. So as a result of that, India was not a very aggressive exporter in this year into China. But we believe that in this calendar year, India is going to increase its plantings by 15 to 20%. And the reason is the same as was there last year. Cotton prices are very low, other competing crops. Sesame is big in Gujarat, which is a peanut planting area in India. Sesame prices are also very low. So sesame has fallen from $2,200, $2,100 to $1,100 in the last 1 year. So India is going to plant a lot of peanuts and potentially export quite a lot of them to China if the right market conditions exist. As far as Indian domestic market is concerned, the popular impression is, again, the rising middle class, peanut consumption should be exploding. But what is happening over there, if you want to see, their crush is a big part of their total peanut consumption, and that has been seeing a significant decline year on year. The affluent strata of the society is moving towards olive oil, sunflower oil, canola oil. In Indian perception, they are healthier alternatives to peanuts, and I don't know why. but that is a perception, and that's why you see the consumption of those oils, which are relatively more expensive, increasing with the trend towards a healthier oil. And the mass segment is moving towards palm because of its lower cost. It's the cheapest vegetable oil, and also it's also very competitive. So we have crushing, which is reducing dramatically in India. Edibles consumption is growing at a significant 7-8% a year, albeit from a very low base. So on the whole, India as a market is not in a position to absorb everything that they grow, and therefore they'll continue to be aggressive as far as exports are concerned. China, crop 15 was, I think, 2 to 3% up as compared to crops 14. 14 had weather issues. Their acreage has still not substantially increased over the last 2-3 years, despite overall commodity sentiment being sort of lukewarm. And the reason is China had very high subsidies initially on cotton, and then they did away with that, then on other grains, where self-sufficiency was the main goal. Today, China has close to, I think, 60 million metric tons of corn stock, and there have been statements by the government that they'll possibly do away with the minimum support price for corn. And if that happens, then the acreage in China could increase very substantially. But if that policy change doesn't happen, peanuts will continue to maintain the acreage. But if the corn subsidies were to go away, and that looks increasingly more likely, then China could see a substantial expansion in acreage. Whether it will happen in 16 or 17, that is something to watch out for, but that's the direction in which China is headed. And if that 5 to 7% expansion happens in China, coupled with the fact that their consumption also seems to be slowing down, crush surprisingly is growing a little bit in China. Edibles, which was growing at 7 to 8% in the previous years, has now slowed down considerably. It's probably growing at 2 to 3%. It's very difficult to get a grip on the consumption numbers in China because of the import barriers, right? So it gets limited by what they produce by and large. Over the years, they have started importing a little bit, but in the last 5 years, if you go to see what is the increase in total consumption in peanuts in China and compare it with increase in other nuts, say pecans or almonds, it's insignificant. So unless something happens on the consumption front in China, the fact that they're looking at possibly expanded supply, China as a market, or the market of last resort, doesn't seem very tenable in the current financial year. So what are the implications for US? So we can expect fierce competition in the export markets owing to excess supply across pretty much every single origin. And the fact that some of the origins like Argentina and Brazil, actually their cost position has improved significantly because of their statutory stance of the government. Brazil will continue to be the cost leader as far as red skins are concerned, and they'll maintain their market share at 100,000 tons of exports. Argentina will be very competitive in blanched peanuts, probably less so as far as red skins are concerned, but still end up exporting close to 500,000 tons, what they usually do. And if China has an expansion in acreage, or even if it maintains an acreage, I think their interest, given what is happening there in the economy in imports, is going to be low, especially the US peanuts. So I see underutilization of shelling capacity in the US as a consequence of all these factors, and lack of export demand, not only for US peanuts, but also affecting Argentina and Brazil. That would be my prognosis, or my guess is what we are likely to experience. So before I close, I'd like to make one statement and drawing my experience on other edible nuts. So in peanuts, the challenge that we have is not about productivity. Okay, peanut industry has been extremely productive, and we've seen prices, a fair price for peanut should be probably 60 cents the consumer would not mind it, and there's an opposition to pay that price. And that price is tenable even in India and China. The problem is that the consumption is not growing. I think that's a crux of the issue. And the kind of promotions that we've seen in almonds, pistachios, that's been sort of even cannibalizing on potentially what could have been the growth in the peanut business. So as an industry, it's an imperative that we have to find a solution, a long-term solution to this issue. And on that note, I'd like to thank you once again, Tyrone, for this opportunity. Thanks.